there is a creature that can survive being frozen to nearly absolute zero, boiled past the point where water turns to steam, crushed under pressure 6 times greater than the deepest trench in the ocean. And in 2007, scientists strapped it to the outside of a satellite and sent it directly into the vacuum of outer space. No spacesuit, no shielding, nothing between it and the void. It survived. Some of them even went on to reproduce afterward, back on Earth. This isn't an alien. It's smaller than a grain of sand, and it's probably living in the moss growing on your roof right now. This is the tardigrade. Tardigrades go by a much friendlier nickname, water bears, or sometimes moss piglets. Under a microscope, it's easy to see why. A plump, segmented body, 8 stubby legs, each ending in tiny claws, shuffling along like a bear crossing a garden. Most species measure under a millimeter long, small enough that an entire tardigrade could comfortably stand on the head of an ant. But don't let the size or the nickname fool you into thinking these are simple animals. They belong to their own entire phylum, Tardigrade, with more than 1,300 known species, and they are almost everywhere. Moss, lichen, the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches, the permanent ice sheets of Antarctica, hot springs. Researchers have even found them in samples taken near the summit of Mount Everest and buried in dry desert soil that hasn't seen rain in years. If there's a thin film of water anywhere on Earth, even briefly, there's a reasonable chance a tardigrade is living in it. They were first described in 1773 by a German pastor and amateur naturalist named Johann August Ephraim Goser, who peered at one through a microscope and called it Kleiner Wasserbär, little water bear. A few years later, the Italian biologist Lazzaro Spallanzani, the same scientist whose 18th century experiments on regenerating salamanders helped kickstart the study of the axolotl, gave the group its scientific name, Tardigrade, meaning slow stepper, for their unhurried, lumbering walk. On their own, tardigrades aren't dangerous, aren't venomous, and aren't particularly remarkable to look at. Most feed by piercing individual plant or algae cells with a needle-like mouthpart and sucking out the contents. A few species are predators that hunt smaller invertebrates, including other tardigrades. By almost every visible measure, this is an unremarkable microscopic animal. The truly strange part is invisible. It's what happens inside their cells when the world around them turns hostile. Here's the part that made tardigrades famous. When their environment dries out, freezes, or becomes otherwise unlivable, a tardigrade doesn't just tolerate it. It essentially shuts itself down. This general strategy is called cryptobiosis, and biologists actually recognize several distinct versions of it. Drying out is called anhydrobiosis. Freezing is cryobiosis. Oxygen deprivation is anoxybiosis, and even extreme salt concentration has its own version, osmobiosis. A tardigrade can trigger whichever version the situation demands. In the most famous version, anhydrobiosis, the animal curls its legs inward, forms a compact ball called a toon, and expels up to 97% of the water in its body. Its metabolism drops to a small fraction of normal, by some estimates, close to undetectable. In this state, a tardigrade isn't really alive in the way we usually define it, but it isn't dead either. It's suspended. Rehydrate it days, months, or, according to one widely reported, but still scientifically debated 2018 study, possibly tens of thousands of years later, after being recovered from ancient permafrost, and it can simply start moving again, as if nothing happened. The mechanism behind this is genuinely elegant. As the water leaves its cells, a tardigrade floods them with a sugar called trehalose, along with a set of specialized proteins. Instead of the cell's internal structures collapsing into a wrinkled mess, the way most dehydrated tissue does, these molecules form a glass-like matrix that holds everything in place: proteins, membranes, even genetic material, locked safely until water returns. Biologists call this vitrification, and it's the same basic principle used to safely freeze certain vaccines and biological samples without refrigeration. Dehydration resistance alone wouldn't explain surviving open space, though. Space brings a second, far deadlier threat: radiation, unfiltered by any atmosphere, capable of shredding DNA apart. For context, a radiation dose of around 5 gray is enough to be lethal to a human. Laboratory studies have found some tardigrade species can withstand doses over 1,000 times higher before losing the ability to reproduce, and even survive briefly at levels roughly 1,000 times beyond that. In 2016, a research team at the University of Tokyo identified a protein unique to tardigrades, which they named Dsup, short for damage suppressor. Dsup physically binds to a tardigrade's DNA and appears to shield it, like a molecular umbrella, reducing the damage caused by radiation exposure. In lab experiments, when researchers inserted the Dsup gene into human cell cultures, those cells showed a meaningfully lower rate of radiation damage than untreated cells. Put the dehydration trick and the radiation shield together, and you get an animal that can survive conditions almost nothing else can. In the 2007 European Space Agency mission known as TARDIS, dehydrated specimens of 2 species, Milnesium tardigradum and Rictersius coronifer, were attached to the outside of a satellite and exposed to the vacuum of space for roughly 10 days. The vacuum alone, most survived. A smaller number even survived the added blast of unfiltered solar ultraviolet radiation, a level of exposure that would be lethal to nearly every other known form of life on Earth, instantly. It remains one of the only times any animal has knowingly been exposed directly to open space and lived. Here's where it's worth slowing down and being precise, because tardigrades get mythologized a lot online, and the real science is impressive enough without exaggeration. Tardigrades are not immortal. Cryptobiosis is not eternal life. It's a dormant, suspended state, and it only works under specific conditions. A hydrated, active tardigrade going about its normal life is just as vulnerable as any other small animal. It can be eaten, crushed, or killed by ordinary environmental stress, like any other creature. The toughest animal on Earth title refers specifically to its ability to survive extremes while dormant, not some general invincibility. It's also worth mentioning that tardigrade research hasn't been free of controversy. A 2015 genome study briefly claimed tardigrades had absorbed an unusually large amount of foreign DNA from bacteria and other organisms, a finding that made headlines but was later shown by independent teams to be largely the result of contamination during sequencing, not a real biological superpower. Good science self-corrects, and that episode is a useful reminder to treat any single dramatic headline with some caution until it's been independently confirmed. What makes tardigrades genuinely important isn't internet hype. It's what they might teach human medicine and space science. Researchers are studying trehalose-based preservation to store vaccines, blood products, and even transplant organs without constant refrigeration, which could be transformative in places without reliable cold chain infrastructure. The Dsup radiation shielding protein is being investigated for its potential to protect astronauts on long-duration missions, or even to reduce collateral damage to healthy tissue during radiation therapy for cancer patients. And then there's the bigger question tardigrades raise for astrobiology. If a complex, multicellular animal from Earth can survive naked exposure to the vacuum and radiation of space, even briefly, it forces scientists to take more seriously the idea that life could, in principle, survive transit between worlds. Nobody is claiming tardigrades are hitchhiking to other planets, but they've quietly moved the boundary of what scientists consider biologically possible. So the next time you look at a patch of ordinary moss, remember there's a decent chance it's holding thousands of animals that have technically been to space and back. Not through any special adaptation for space travel, just an extreme talent for waiting out the worst the universe can throw at them. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it just looks like knowing exactly when to shut everything down and wait. If you want more stories about the strangest, most scientifically important creatures on Earth, subscribe. This is only getting stranger from here. Stranger from here.